afternoon, everyone. I wanted to say briefly, we are very thankful to have Andrew come out and visit us so that he can inform us about the work that he's done, about the work that we'll be doing with our parish. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, as I think you all know, I'm a specialist in the design of Orthodox church buildings, and we've been meeting the last 2 days for many, many hours to discuss what sort of building form and construction techniques and styles may be best suited to your new church building. I'm not going to talk so much about your project because we're just at the very beginning of conceiving and designing that. But just to introduce you all to my work, I'm going to go through a slideshow of past projects that I've done, simply so that you can become familiar with what I do. And then we'll have a bit of time at the end to do some questions. So my first project out of architecture school was designing my own parish church, which is in Charleston, South Carolina. That's where I've lived for the past 17 years. And when I moved to Charleston, was asked to do this. We spent several months working on designing it, and then about a year of fundraising it, and then 2 years to build the structure, followed by many, many years of painting the iconography and building furnishings and so forth. And that's still underway all these years later. Let's see. Guess that's not going to work. Then that's not on. Oh, I'll just stand here then. Oh dear, even these aren't working. Let's see, there are. Okay, thanks. So Charleston is the largest and oldest historic district in the country, and we felt it was very important, if we're going to build an Orthodox church in Charleston, that it should look like it's part of the architectural tradition and history of our city. And I think that's important everywhere, that we don't want to just build churches that look like they're a copy of a church in Greece or Russia. We want to build churches that look like they are part of the indigenous cultural tradition, particularly the building tradition of where they come from. And so in Charleston, we have predominantly 18th and 19th century masonry houses that look like this. And they have a number of aspects to their construction that's very sympathetic to Russian Orthodox architecture. For instance, the sawtooth brick cornice at the top, the stuccoed finish, painted pastel colors, the use of copper roofs. All of these are things that we see in Russian church architecture. And so when I designed our church, I had this sort of this fictional history that what would it look like had there been Russian immigrants to Charleston in the mid-19th century who had built an Orthodox church there. It's not even so far-fetched a history. It could have happened. We have an Irish church and an Italian church and a French Huguenot church downtown. You know, had we had Russians the way New York and San Francisco did at the time, we could have had a Russian church built. And so I used a kind of a eclectic mixture of Byzantine and Russian dome shapes, which is very typical of 19th century Russian architecture. And I designed the church using the materials of Charleston, where it's a stucco finish painted a yellow ochre color, a copper roof, an extensive use of old red bricks that are actually reclaimed from old Charleston buildings. And a lot of use of southern yellow pine, much of which is reclaimed wood as well, which is the predominant wood species in these South Carolina buildings. And so when the church was first built, it looked like this. It's a bare plaster interior and a yellow pine iconostasis. And the columns are made of concrete, and I polished and oiled them so that they look like old stone. And it's fairly classically Byzantine style on the interior. You get wonderful sunbeams through the dome windows. And then a few years after it was built, we had enough money to start bringing in teams of iconographers to start painting. And we do this the right way, which is painting directly on the plastered wall. We don't use canvas. So this is the apse over the altar. And I particularly love the contrast between the warm golden color of the iconostasis and the cool grayish blue color of the frescoes. This is a contrast that we see in many historic churches in the old world, that the iconostasis is sort of intense in its coloration and sort of represents the divine energies, the divine fire, whereas the frescoes are cool and restful in their color scheme and more represent the hesychastic side of prayer, the prayer of silence. And I did the iconostasis in the medieval way, which is that the doors themselves are just icon boards, not within any wooden frame. So the icons really dominate the structure of the iconostasis. And then after that, we were able to start doing chandeliers, and that's something I do myself. I made this huge 18-foot diameter Koros chandelier in my workshop. Yes. Thank you. And the Koros chandelier was a type of chandelier that first appeared in Serbia in the 13th century. And it's a brilliant invention because it allows the chandelier to be the full diameter of the dome, and it hangs from the outside edge of the dome so that there's nothing to obstruct the view of the Pantocrator looking straight up through it. Our church is fairly small. It holds about 130 people. So then some years after that, we were able to get iconographers back to paint the dome. And I made decorative grills to put in the dome windows with hand-blown glass. This is the view from the narthex. And I made another smaller Horus chandelier for the nave. So we're starting to get towards that very rich aesthetic of layered spaces and chandeliers in front of frescoes and so forth that we see in all of the old world churches, on Mount Athos or St. Catherine Sinai, places that are actually have all of their liturgical furnishings intact. Orthodox churches tend towards this maximalist aesthetic of there's always layers and layers of mystery. There's not just one thing to see at a time. We have a baptismal font under a trapdoor in the floor of the narthex. And we had a lot of parishioners donate work to beautify the church. For instance, we had a parishioner who made stained glass windows and wanted to do something. So I designed these stained glass windows for the parish hall in Byzantine style for him to make. And I made a chandelier to match. And we have a beautiful liturgical forecourt garden in front of the doors, which is wonderful for the service of the Pascha Vigil after the procession, where there's the station outside the west doors of the church, which is what you see in this picture. And that's that forecourt. And gardens around the church are very important. The church should seem like it's set within a paradise garden, a sort of symbolism of the Garden of Eden before you enter the narthex, which represents the fall, and then enter the nave, which represents the sanctified world, the church. And Charleston has a particular emphasis on garden culture. So it's kind of what Charleston is famous for in the tourist district downtown, is the beautiful formal gardens. So we thought it was very important to put a lot of resources into surrounding the church with these formal gardens and brick paths. Again, to show that we're rooted into the local culture, that we're baptizing the local traditions and beauty into the service of the Orthodox Church. That's what the church looks like now after 10 years of the gardens growing up. Here's some pictures of it under construction. The walls are all built out of concrete block, 2 blocks thick. So we get a 16-inch thick solid concrete wall. And all the arches are traditionally built out of solid masonry. This is me carving the column capitals out of concrete. And then the roof structures are wood framed and all covered in copper. And this is plastering the interior. There's no sheetrock in the building. It's all real lime plaster. And these are the roofers making the copper crosses for the roof. I'm going to go on to my next project now. Maybe before I do that, does anyone have any questions about that project? The candles on top are electric, and the oil lamps hanging below are real oil lamps. And we light those on special feast days. Yes?
I've been to your church.
Good.
And I just said, like, I was absolutely floored by it. It's something I walked in and sense of just it's a beauty. I came home and told them all about it, never thinking I would see it again or know the person who created it.
Wonderful.
When you were doing the iconography, like in the dome or whatever, how long a process is that for the actual, like how long did you have to allot for that?
The painters were working up in the dome for 6 weeks. Yeah, that was a team of 3 people. Yes?
How long did it take to get it fully furnished and fully built?
Well, it took 2 years of construction before it was finished to the point that we were allowed to move in. And 10 years later, it still isn't fully furnished. We're still painting the icons, and we still have a fair amount of temporary liturgical furniture that I want to replace with better quality things.
How did the windows inside the dome affect
The windows in the dome? Well, the windows are fairly small, so typically in an Orthodox church, the windows are not sizable enough to have much acoustical effect. It's in like a Gothic cathedral where the stained glass windows cover the majority of the wall surface, they can have a considerable acoustic effect, mainly in that they absorb a lot of bass, because stained glass windows are a little bit flimsy and they shake and absorb the bass reverberance out of the sound. But Orthodox churches, because they tend to be all plaster and stone and have relatively small windows, are pretty reverberant and reflective across all frequencies. So I'm going to move on to some other projects in different parts of the country. After I did Holy Ascension, I was asked to design a church in Denton, Texas, in the Denton-Fort Worth area. And that part of the country has a very distinct Spanish-influenced building tradition. All the old buildings look like this. So I designed a church that's got some of that Spanish mission styling that incorporates the red sandstone that old buildings in Denton have. This was the rendering of the interior. And that project ran into some roadblocks. The lot was actually incorporated into a historic district after I designed the church. And after some negotiations with the city, we were compromised that they weren't allowed to build the church directly in front of the historic house on the property, but if we turned it sideways and moved it off to the side and made it a little bit shorter and simpler, the historic district agreed to approve it. So this is the ultimate design made out of masonry with red brick trim and details on it. And we're hoping to move into construction of that pretty soon. And I did a project in Indiana where it's out in the plains, and they wanted a big wooden church. So I designed it in kind of the style of old wooden Protestant churches and farmhouses in the region, where it's clapboard siding and sort of Victorian style timber posts on the porch. And I designed the interior as a timber frame structure, partially modeled on the stave churches of Norway. I don't know if you're familiar with these 1,000-year-old churches in Scandinavia, but Scandinavia was very closely tied to the Byzantine Empire in those days. There were trade routes all the way from Crimea up the Volga River, right to Norway, and the whole of the Eastern world from Crimea all the way through Russia up to Scandinavia was ruled by the Kiev and Russian Empire, which basically built in Byzantine style. So all the way up in Norway, you see wooden churches that use these Byzantine style columns and capitals and arches. So I thought it would be fun to build a wooden church using that kind of Viking Byzantine style of architecture. And then I was asked to design a project in the Netherlands. They gave me a site on a canal, very typical of Dutch architecture. And the priest really wanted the church to look like an old Dutch building. And this type of roof line is very typical of Dutch architecture. And he asked me to try to design an Orthodox church that looks like this kind of old Dutch farmhouse roof line. And so this was my proposal. So you can see a lot of Dutch influences, like the Baroque tower with a carillon in it. And then for the inside of the church, I modeled it on very early Romanesque churches in Western Europe. This is a church built around the year 1000 in the Pyrenees. And you can see, if you go far enough back in Western European architecture, it starts to look very Orthodox with the apse fresco and everything. So I used that type of early Romanesque interior for this church. I was asked to design a church in British Columbia on Lake Kootenay. And this is a site where a retired couple has bought a hillside in a very remote wilderness area, and is operating it as an Orthodox retreat center. And they asked me to sort of organize the hillside into terraced gardens like you would see on Mount Athos, and design a stone chapel that they can build out of the native stone that's right there on their site. And so I went there and I looked at their stone and designed all of this around what they can do just on site with bringing in a minimal of construction materials, because it's a very remote place. And it's just a little chapel that holds about 15 people. This is under construction now. I was asked to design a quite a large church in Greenville, South Carolina. That's at the other end of the state from Charleston, where it's starting to get a little bit mountainous. And this parish wanted a church for about 350, 400 people, and they wanted to do it in wood. So again, yeah, there's a lot of Victorian houses in this area that have rather ornate wood exteriors. So I kind of, came up with this idea, what would it look like if you built a Byzantine church in the manner of construction that was common in late 19th century America for sort of Victorian wood construction. And these are my renderings of what it would look like. You can see in the ancient Byzantine churches that are made of masonry, they would panel the lower parts of the walls in marble. So here, doing it in wood, I have the lower parts of the walls paneled in yellow pine. Some renderings of how that fits on the site. And so that church was built a couple of years ago. They've moved into it a couple of years ago, but there's still a lot left to do. They're going to add the wraparound porches that you saw in the renderings. And I made all the chandeliers for this church as well. They're painting the dome right now. So in the spring, as they're done with that painting and start to take the scaffolding down, I'm going to go in and put in a Koros chandelier under the dome. And this is the narthex. This is the iconographer. This iconographer, Seraphim O'Keefe, he's painting this entire church all by himself, and he's anticipating living there on the site for 5 years. This is a picture of it under construction. You can see how complicated it is to do this kind of architecture in wood. Also in Greenville, I was asked to design a large Roman Catholic church. The priest wanted a church that would seat about 600 people, and he wanted it to be in what you might call Italo-Byzantine or Italian Romanesque style. A large basilica church, and these were our renderings of it. And this church was ultimately completed by a large Catholic architecture firm. It's not exactly the way I would have done it, but they mainly followed the bones of the design that I handed to them. These are some pictures of it. In Charlotte, North Carolina, I was asked to design a parish for a little Rokor church that had a site hidden in the woods, and they were very enthusiastic about doing a Russian village style church out of logs. So I went to Russia, and in particular was studying this building, which was built in the 17th century in Suzdal, and this was the model for the church that I designed. Also, some of these Ukrainian churches of the 18th and 19th centuries have some beautiful details where they actually do arches out of logs, like you see here. And these old village churches had very simple iconostases that are essentially just icons touching one another and almost no structure at all, which I really like. So this was the rendering I did for that church. And again, you can see all these features. It's completely built out of squared logs, arches just cut right out of the shapes of the logs, village style iconostasis. I was asked to design some buildings in New Mexico. And New Mexico, of course, has the oldest building tradition of anywhere in our country. There are buildings in New Mexico that are 500 years old, like this building here. This was the the governor's palace of the Mexican Empire in the 16th century. And to this day, all of the buildings in the Santa Fe area are built in this same post and adobe style of architecture. And of course, there's very, very old Catholic churches in New Mexico that have this type of thick adobe walls and a beamed ceiling, and these retablos that are very much like an Orthodox iconostasis. And in New Mexico, there's already a established tradition of Orthodox worship that's kind of absorbed this style. This is the St. Michael's Monastery in Cañones, New Mexico, where you can see they use the native Indian style weavings, and they have a shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe, whose veneration has been blessed in the Orthodox Church. And they serve the services mostly in Spanish there because they're in a little Spanish-speaking Indian village. So I was asked to design an expansion of this monastery, kind of organizing their sloping terrain into terraces and gardens and designing additional monastic buildings built in the local style. And I designed a large church for a parish in Albuquerque, which again is in this native adobe style. So I wanted to use the old Spanish style of church building where it's got the wood beamed ceiling, but expand it wider to be more suitable as an Orthodox church and put a dome up inside the wood ceiling. I was then asked to design a monastery chapel at St. Gregory Palamus Monastery in Ohio. That's an English-speaking monastery of the Greek Archdiocese. And they had this old chapel that was built in the 1980s that was just very cheaply built. This was the inside. It was really built on the cheap, and they wanted to replace it with a better quality chapel, but on the same footprint and foundation as the old chapel. So this was my design for that. And they're in Amish farm country there. There's horses and buggies going down the street right in front of the monastery, and beautiful old barns and farmhouses all around them. So I designed the exterior out of wood in the local sort of farmhouse style of construction, but they wanted the inside to be mostly plastered and very Athonite looking. So that church, again, was built about 2 years ago, and they're still working on decorating. This was when it was under construction, and some pictures of the interior under construction. This one was very interesting because we decided to build this building as a prefabricated kit of parts. So the exterior walls are SIPs, structural insulating panels, that were all factory cut to the right shapes. And the interior is a mixture of steel elements and big plywood arches that were all factory prepared. And so all these parts arrived on site, and they were all just bolted together, and the whole structure was built in just a few weeks. And then the inside's all lathed and plastered. This is a local blacksmith that they hired to make the wrought iron cross for the top of the dome. So I designed this to be sort of a Byzantine style cross with an American wheat motif in it. And there's the church all finished. The consecration. So here's how it looks, all finished, all plastered and furnished. The monastery has a woodworking shop and make all their own furnishings and chandeliers. And they have a Russian iconographer from Dallas, Vladimir Grigorenko, comes up there periodically and works on painting it. So it's about a third painted on the inside right now. I was very pleased that a Greek Archdiocese monastery was willing to hire a Russian iconographer. I think that's a first. I was asked to design another monastic chapel, this one on Spruce Island in Alaska. There's a monastery on Spruce Island that's in the Serbian Patriarchate, which way up on a mountainside. You can see they have this building that was built about 40 years ago, and they wanted to expand and have a real freestanding chapel, and we decided to put it up on this hillside. And so it's surrounded by very tall spruce trees. So I designed a tall, narrow wooden building in the kind of in the style of a Russian Old Believer church. And they wanted a distinctive form that doesn't copy any of the 100 or so historic churches that are in Alaska. So this is the foundation under construction and framing it up. It's incredibly hard to build anything there. Any materials have to be brought in on a barge across the ocean and then hauled up a mountainside. So almost all of the wood is stuff that they milled on site by hand out of their own trees. I actually had the windows made for them in Charleston and shipped all the way to Spruce Island because they couldn't find anyone in Alaska who could make these old Russian style windows, single glazed with hand blown glass. And then I was asked to design a big church for the Rokor Monastery, Holy Cross Hermitage in West Virginia, which that's a pretty big monastery now. They've got about 45 monks, and they're located in what's called a holler, a mountain valley, and they wanted a church that would hold about 250 people. It's kind of in a Russian tradition, but also with Appalachian elements like this timber frame porch. And they wanted a big bell tower. They've been donated a very large and important set of Russian bells that are going to hang in there. So for the interior of this church, I wanted to do a lot of timber framing. So the ceilings are all timber truss and beamed ceilings, but the walls and arches and dome are solid masonry. Very authentic medieval sort of construction. This church is under construction now. They're just starting it. This is the foundation. Another Appalachian church. This is a church I recently designed for Oak Ridge, Tennessee. It's an interesting project because Oak Ridge has no historic architecture older than World War II, because Oak Ridge was built as a secret military base for the Manhattan Project in the middle of nowhere. So there's absolutely nothing there that predates the 40s. So because all of the old buildings in Oak Ridge are of kind of a mid-century modern style, I didn't really think it would fit to do a building that looks older than that. So I tried to design an Orthodox church that has a little bit of interesting mid-century styling to it, particularly on the inside. It's got these rounded corners and round windows, and kind of looks like the American churches that were being built in the 40s, kind of at the tail end of traditional church construction. And again, they really wanted a lot of timber in this building to have an Appalachian look about it. Working on a church in St. George, Utah, a big Antiochian parish. which is kind of near the Grand Canyon. So it's really seriously in the desert. And I've been developing up a sort of southwestern desert style of architecture for that. I'll just briefly talk about some of my liturgical craft work. This is my little workshop under my house where I do these iron chandeliers. And I've made these Koros chandeliers for quite a few existing churches. This one's in the Netherlands. This is a Russian Orthodox parish that bought an enormous Gothic church building that was sold by the Catholic Church and asked me to design a Koros chandelier about 22 feet in diameter. That was interesting because I had to do the inscription in Dutch. And I put Dutch galleons of the 17th century in there because that's kind of a paradise motif for Dutchmen. It's the symbol of the golden age. This was the most recent one I did and the largest. This is in a Melkite church in Washington, D.C. They have this rather odd building that's got a big low ceiling with a huge circle in the middle. And so I made a Koros 28 feet in diameter to fit that. And just a selection of some of the smaller chandeliers that I've made. And I've done a lot of design for wooden furnishings as well, processional implements like you see here. Gospel book covers. Many of these things I've done in collaboration with Jonathan Peugeot, the icon carver. This is an altar cross, again inlaid with Jonathan's carvings, and then I do all the woodwork and the marquetry. This is a ornate icon we did collaboratively where he did the stone carving and I did the metal work and gemstone work. This is one of these ornate icons that we did as a commission for Jordan Peterson. And we've done some gravestones together where I design it and have the stone fabricated and then he comes and carves it. I've designed a number of iconostases. This was a favorite project of mine. It's something that's specifically designed as a mission church iconostasis, meaning it's freestanding and movable and is meant to be set up in temporary rental spaces for mission churches. Because I feel strongly that mission churches ought to have a professionally made iconostasis with real icons in it, and that they should be handed from one mission to another as a mission outgrows them and builds a real church, that these things should be sort of permanent pieces of furniture that get passed on to the next church that needs them. So this was a prototype for that project. It's currently in use at the Mission Church in Baton Rouge. And this was all painted by a friend of mine who lives in South Dakota, a Russian iconographer. Another iconostasis, which is under construction right now in Corning, New York. Some furniture I've made, analogian in a Russian monastic style. This is an altar set for a Coptic church in California. This is Chanter's Stasidia for the Greek Orthodox Cathedral in Baltimore. they have a beautiful Victorian building that they bought from a Protestant congregation, and I designed all this furniture for them out of oak in the style of the old Victorian furnishings of the building. And this is at the Rokor Monastery in West Virginia. They asked me to design some very splendid icon kiosks and reliquaries, in particular to hold relics of the Romanov martyrs that they had been given by the Moscow Patriarchate. So I made this inlaid reliquary for them in the form of a Roman sarcophagus. These are the furniture makers who did most of the woodwork for me. And then I tend to do the detailed things like the metal icon frames in my own workshop. This is me cutting out the pieces of mother of pearl for the imperial Romanov eagle inlaid into the top of the reliquary. So I think that's the end of my slideshow. I hope that gives you a good idea of the breadth of things that I do. I'll open up for questions.
So if you have a question, raise your hand. We'll like this. People on the outside.
So I really appreciate the way that you kind of try to incorporate a lot of local elements into your designs. And I'm curious how you approach like coming to maybe a new region and thinking about, all right, what's the balance between local influence and kind of having distinctly kind of Orthodox feel?
Yeah, well, it's a very different experience in different regions. America has a remarkably diverse architectural history. If you go back to colonial times, between the historically English or historically Spanish or historically French parts of the country. But on the other hand, as you get into the late 19th century, America has remarkably consistent architecture from one end to the other, like the old buildings in downtown Portland, which aren't, don't go back much older than the 1880s, look like old buildings that you could see in any American city from coast to coast. So sometimes those old building traditions that have some real sympathy to Orthodox building traditions and where there's a happy marriage there. Other times there really isn't much to draw from. And in those cases, I have to draw more from the appearance of the landscape than from local building traditions. Because of course, if you look at old world Orthodox architecture, you can see a great deal of visual sort of consonance between the way they build their churches and the way their landscape looks, sort of ecologically. So for instance, on the Greek islands, where you have these islands that are sort of made out of white marble and have soft rounded shapes set into a turquoise sea, we see the famous Greek island chapels that are painted white and have an azure blue dome and soft rounded shapes. There's an obvious visual relationship between the churches and the landscape in which they're built. Whereas if you go to the Republic of Georgia, where it's all jagged dark brown mountains, the churches are made of dark brown stone and have very pointy steeply roofs. And if you go to Romania, where it's all dark pine forests, the Romanian churches have these dark shingled wooden roofs that are all points and steeples and flaring eaves that kind of mimic the shape of the pine trees that surround the churches. So that's I think something that we can do in places that don't have a lot of architectural history, is we can just look at the landscape and we can look at the old world and say, where are there places that have a landscape like this? But here in Oregon, I think there's a lot about your landscape around here that's reminiscent of Italy, particularly northern Italy, getting up into the Lombardy region. It's you have a somewhat sort of Mediterranean farmland look about the landscape here. versus working in Appalachia, where it looks a lot like Serbia or Romania, for instance. Or when I'm designing churches in the desert in the Southwest, and I'd be looking at old churches in Syria and Palestine.
I was wondering if you've spoken a lot about churches, if you could talk a little bit about the church communities you worked with, and sort of the different experiences that you've had there in terms of the building process and viewpoints and things like that.
Well, it really does vary a lot. I'd say the biggest question that most parishes face is if they can't afford to build a church and a parish hall at the same time, which seldom can they. You know, there's a question about which to build first, and I always recommend building the church first, because what I've observed is that church communities are kind of a self-selecting feedback loop, in the sense that people go to a church that does what they like now. People don't choose to attend a church that is going to do something in 5 years that they're going to like. So churches that choose to build a multi-purpose building first and have a big emphasis on coffee hour and Sunday school, and don't have a big emphasis on liturgical beauty, they may grow as a church, but they may grow entirely out of people who care a lot about programs like coffee hour and Sunday school, and don't care a lot about liturgical beauty, because the people who care about liturgical beauty are going to go elsewhere to a church that's already got that. And as a result, churches that spend a lot of years in a multi-purpose building without much liturgical beauty, it can be very hard for them to build a consensus that they actually ever need to really build their church. Because when they survey their congregation and say, you know, let's raise millions of dollars to build a church, there's a lot of attitude of, you know, why we're doing just fine where we are, and, you know, we've had a cheap metal building for 10 years, why do we suddenly need an expensive masonry building? And so as a result, these mission churches that build a hall first, they don't have a very good track record of ultimately building their church. They often go decades without building a church, and will even, which can even mean they go long enough that they stop growing and start going into a decline without ever having gotten to that point. Whereas in contrast, churches that choose to build a really beautiful church first, they self-select towards people who care a lot about liturgy, people who want to go there because the church is beautiful, because the choir sounds good, because the iconography is inspiring, and that have a robust schedule of a lot of liturgical services. And so a church that builds a beautiful temple first will end up with a congregation that values that. And so so these churches tend to do very well, and they tend to build their hall. It doesn't take them as long. I think they tend to grow. They grow better, and they have a stronger consensus about doing everything with quality. So this is my observation of having visited a great many churches. I have even had the experience where a new priest at a mission, you know, will hire me to come and try to talk their church into building a church because they're in a multi-purpose building, and we just cannot build that consensus. There's just really not any interest in the people there in doing anything different than they've always done, and the project never happens. So that's I'd say my most important observation of visiting churches is you will end up with a congregation that mirrors what you build.
So all of your churches, I noticed in the slideshow, were based off of the older churches somewhere in that area, or the older buildings. Have you ever made a more modern style church?
Well, I myself specialize in designing traditional style buildings. So by modern, I think what you mean is in a modernistic style. And no, I don't personally think that the modernistic style is an appropriate match for an Orthodox church. There's a lot of reasons I would say that, but at the simplest level, the reason is this. Orthodox church architecture is all about being introverted and sort of fortified. Orthodox churches tend to have thick walls, small windows, and when you're inside an Orthodox church, it's a completely introverted liturgical experience. That is to say, the buildings are deliberately designed to make you feel like you're no longer in the world and that you have no awareness of the world outside the walls when you're in there. That's almost the single most explicit design criteria for an Orthodox church is introversion. And modernistic architecture is almost exactly the opposite of that. Modernistic architecture is about thin, lightweight construction, a lot of glass, a lot of connection between indoors and outdoors. And so in a sense, sort of the quintessential modernistic church building is the Crystal Cathedral in California, where it's entirely glass everywhere and it almost looks the same as standing outdoors. So, you know, I don't mean to say that modernistic architecture is always bad. There's certainly building types for which extroverted buildings with a lot of glass can be really beautiful, but not for a Orthodox liturgical space. It's almost absolutely exactly wrong for what we want in a church design. So that's one reason where I really say don't try to bring any influence of the modernistic international style of architecture into an Orthodox church. It's exactly incompatible with the tradition of Byzantine or Russian architecture.
Andrew, there's a couple of questions on the YouTube feed around the use of rebar or just the fact that we live in an earthquake prone area. What can you have to share on that?
Sure. Well, I design my masonry churches out of basically reinforced concrete block, and you know that's pretty good in earthquakes. The structural engineer will determine the amount of rebar and the strength coefficient of the concrete as needed to meet the earthquake codes in your area. So yeah, I would say that's not a very difficult problem to solve with modern construction. That was almost an unsolvable problem historically when people were building churches out of unreinforced brick and stone, that churches could be quite vulnerable to earthquakes, but yeah, that's not so much a problem now. Yes?
What kind of ideas do you have when you get the market as far as what type of materials and how you bring the styles of the cigarette project?
Yes?
Could you repeat the question since it wasn't on the mic? They can't hear.
Yes, she asked what ideas I have for your project here in terms of styles and materials. Well, after many hours of discussions on this over the last couple of days, we've kind of come to a consensus of building a church that would have masonry walls that would be mostly stucco finish on the outside and timber frame roofs, so that there'd be a considerable use of the local Douglas fir timber ceilings like you have in here, which is a great local tradition. And that the form of the church would be what might be called a domed basilica, meaning it's got a cruciform plan that's got timber roofs over the arms of the cross, and then a central crossing that's got a Byzantine sort of dome on it. And yeah, so again, you know, the Pacific Northwest is a difficult area in terms of architectural history. You don't, you know, unless you're going to include Native American styles, which is kind of difficult to figure out how to do that in an Orthodox context. You know, you don't have much architectural history distinctive of the Pacific Northwest. So, you know, I think a lot of use of your local Douglas fir, and just sort of trying to do a general building form that looks good in your verdant landscape, is mostly what we can go with. And I tend to like a color scheme for buildings that's kind of heavy on red and white in this kind of a landscape. If you can picture, for instance, churches in Italy or on the Greek mainland, they tend to have white stucco exteriors and red tile roofs and a lot of red terracotta or brick paving. And that kind of red and white masonry color scheme looks really beautiful in a verdant landscape with rolling hills, like in Greece and Italy. And I think it would look beautiful here. And I noticed in downtown Portland, most of the really ornate late 19th century buildings have that red and white color scheme. There's a lot of beautiful buildings downtown that are a mixture of red and white brick, or red brick with white stone trim, or white churches with red metal roofs. And, you know, it seems to be a thing that was recognized here in the late 19th century as a good fit for your landscape.
Quick question. I'm not suggesting it, but have you looked at St. Nicholas in Portland?
I've looked at pictures of it.
Okay, just when I've gone in there, it struck me that it's sort of very northwest, but I would just wonder what your feedback was on how you thought it worked.
Well, and are you saying that because of the use of timber?
Because of the use of timber and exposed metal, the way that they
Yes.
use iron and stuff. I don't know. It was
Sure.
interesting to me.
Yeah, and I think that kind of architecture is associated with the Pacific Northwest for a couple of reasons. Partly it relates to a sort of style of mountain lodge architecture that you can find in mountainous sort of nature park areas anywhere. On the East Coast, for instance, it's called Adirondack style because there were so many sort of ski lodges and hunting lodges built in the mountains around New York City in the 19th century in the Adirondacks. That kind of architecture took on that name, and it then was spread all over the country by the National Park Service that built these sort of, what you might call sort of Swiss or Adirondack style lodge buildings in the national parks all through the American West. And that kind of made it very popular in regions that are mountainous and that have a cultural focus on outdoorsmanship, tended to, start to really favor that kind of timber architecture. And it's also a particularly good fit for the Pacific Northwest because this is where Douglas fir comes from. And Douglas fir is the very best wood for doing this kind of timber work. It's very reliable, straight, strong structural lumber, and it's got a beautiful, rich, sort of medium pinkish gold color to it. Even where I come from in South Carolina, timber framers very often import Douglas fir from the Pacific Northwest for timber frames because it's such a good wood for the purpose.
How long would you think it would take until a church would be built enough so we could move into it?
Well, I would say if you proceed relatively quickly with buying that land and raising some money and moving at a pretty good pace from design into construction, it would probably be done within 3 years because it'll probably take at least a year, maybe a little more than a year to go through all the process of purchasing the land and doing all the design work and getting all the permits. And it usually takes a number of months to negotiate construction contracts with a builder. And then once construction is actually underway, probably a year and a half to build a church like this.
So with the building, what materials would they be made out of? Like would it be made out of wood, stone, metal?
Well, like many of the buildings I showed you in my slideshow here, the walls would probably be concrete block that are covered with stucco and plaster, and the roof structure would be timber trusses.
2 more questions from online. One is, have you seen St. George? And a second is, would you also be able to help design a garden space around the church?
Yes. Yeah. I've looked at pictures of all the Orthodox churches in the area. And yeah, I can help with gardens. Usually when it comes to garden design, I design the hardscape, meaning the paving materials and the walls. And I don't usually do the plants. That's something that's quite locally specific. And you know, I do recommend that the forecourt garden, meaning the space immediately in front of the church, be done as a very formal space where it's sort of a symmetrical square sort of garden with a bit of a wall around it and symmetrical planting beds and a lot of paving and paths, you know, like what you might see in Italy as what they would call a paradise garden. But then the rest of your landscaping should probably be more landscaping style gardening than formal gardening. So I could picture sort of meandering paths and hedges and maybe a little bridge over the creek. And I think that combination of having informal landscaping and then a central formal garden, that's the right way to do it. And I think once you're actually at that point of having your church built and your hardscape in and you're getting into actually planting plants, I think you're going to have a lot of volunteers who want to spend their time at that site doing gardening. It'll be a beautiful way of life, particularly for retired people, to just make that their vocation and build beautiful gardens there.
So this is going to be the last question.
So you just mentioned in answering one of the other ones that possibly we would use concrete block and stucco for the exterior. I think so, you know, I mean, and you know, I'm sure you looked at, you know, we live in the Northwest. We get even moss growing on the rubber next to the window on our car. Moss grows everywhere. I mean, is there a way to keep the stucco clean and looking and not get mossy? Would be a better, maybe cedar, something that's less likely? I mean, you know, because like I said, we grow moss everywhere on everything.
Yeah,
in the Northwest.
sure. Well, the nice thing about stuccoed concrete is nothing will hurt it. You know, it can grow all the moss at once and it's not going to damage the concrete. One way to reduce that phenomenon is using an appropriate type of paint. There's a paint called silicate paint, which is specially formulated for putting on masonry, and it's widely used on authentic stuccoed masonry buildings like this. And it has some great properties, which is that it is hydrophobic but vapor permeable, so it keeps the wall dry. The rainwater will run right off of it, but any water in the wall will evaporate through it. It's also got an alkali pH, which inhibits growth of algae and moss. So it'll help. It'll do a lot better than like an old brick wall that's always kind of soaking wet after it rains, for instance. But yeah, on the north side, I'm sure it will still gradually grow some stuff, which you might want to power wash off from time to time. But generally speaking, a solid masonry exterior like that is about as low maintenance as you can get, and short of something very modern like stainless steel cladding.
Thank you very much for your time, and we'll finish with a prayer, especially a prayer as we go forward. This is just the beginning of our relationship. Christ, our God, we thank you for this weekend and the time that we've had to begin working towards this beautiful and God-pleasing church that will be to your glory. We pray that you continue to guide us, grant us endurance and wisdom and fortitude, that we may have peace with one another as we continue this process. For you are holy, always, now and ever, in the ages of ages.
Amen.